we are going to meet Jennifer Adler. She's a conservation photographer and underwater photojournalist. Her work is informed by her scientific background, and she uses her imagery to communicate science and conservation. She specializes in underwater photography and is a trained freediver and cave diver. She is currently living aboard her 42-foot sailboat, traveling around the world, producing photojournalistic stories and marine science and about marine science and conservation. So let's bring her in here. Now, the last few times I've hosted her, she was chilling on the boat. Looks like we're in a different location today, but that's okay.
Yeah, I'm in South Florida doing a freediving course this weekend, actually.
Oh, very cool. Does that mean the weather's holding up?
No, it doesn't. We did a lot of classroom stuff today and did some sort of confined water skills, but we're keeping our fingers crossed for tomorrow, so we might get a chance to go out in the afternoon, but we'll see.
All right, awesome. Well, I'm going to let you get right into it. Pop you up full screen, and then we'll grab a couple questions after.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, Joe.
All right, thank you, Jenny.
Yeah. All right, so can you see my screen?
Yeah, it's just starting to load. I think there we go. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I am an underwater photojournalist, and I'm actually originally trained in science. And over about the past 10 years, I've spent most of my time studying, researching, and swimming in Florida's freshwater springs. And Florida is home to the highest density of freshwater springs in the world. And we have more than 1,000 of them here in the state. And the really cool part about them is that there are these direct connections to the underlying aquifer that supplies more than 30%, more than 90% of us here in Florida with our drinking water. These springs are also really amazing places to kind of cool off during the really hot summer months. The water is 72 degrees year round, which reflects the average year round temperature here in Florida. And so we can really kind of disconnect from everyday life and explore these places, besides also relying on them as our drinking water. They're also home to really incredible species such as manatees, which are seen here, and they use the springs actually as refuges from the cold water in the ocean during the chillier winter months. Because like I said, the water is 72 year round here, and the manatees actually lack this true blubber layer like seals and whales have. So as I started swimming in these springs when I first moved to Florida 10 years ago, I was just spending every spare minute I had in these waters, and I was documenting them with a camera, and I started to realize this huge disconnect between people and their fresh water. So Florida is now the third most populous state in the country. And so we have these many, many millions of people in this state living basically on top of our drinking water, because the aquifer is beneath our feet here in Florida throughout almost the entire state. And that water from the aquifer is what flows up at the springs. So I like to say that we are walking on our water here in Florida. And the implications of living on top of that water are basically that, especially in certain areas where the aquifer is more permeable, so where more things can get through from the surface down into the aquifer, it's really vulnerable. And so what we do at the surface impacts our drinking water directly, but since we can't see it, we often have a hard time connecting with it. I found along the way that since people weren't always engaged with the springs or with their fresh waters, one way that you could kind of grab people and effectively communicate science and engage people outside of the ivory tower while I was, in grad school at the University of Florida was through taking photographs and sharing them. And I started getting more questions about my photos than about, the science that I was doing in school. And I started realizing that these photos can actually help convey this complex scientific research that may otherwise never leave the pages of a scientific journal. So we can take photos like this that are pretty, and they show these incredible ecosystems, how clear the water is, how much the grass is flowing, and these kind of more beautiful photos can inspire people to explore or visit or protect nature, or maybe water specifically, or just maybe make people aware that these places exist. But if we're going to show photos like this, we also have to show this, or else we're leaving out a crucial part of the narrative when we tell the story. So these two photos are actually the exact same location in the same spring, taken 1 year apart. And there are a complex array of reasons why our springs are degrading like this and why the grass is going from looking like this to completely disappearing. But when I was writing scientific papers and talking to other scientists about what was going on, scientists would quantify this by saying that there is a statistically significant change in the amount of vegetation in the spring. And you're going to lose people, obviously, when you say that, and they're going to have no idea what you mean. So photographs can help communicate these changes happening in ecosystems over time in a more impactful way. And we'll return to this story of the disappearing grasses and changes in Florida springs later. But this is in a 1960 edition of Time magazine, they wrote that it is the very absence of motion that gives the great photograph, its unique qualities. It arrests the eye, invites reflection, and provokes emotion. And it is often this very emotion that is missing and lacking in science. And photos and words are incredibly powerful. Like, as I mentioned before, the vegetation is disappearing in Florida springs. You can look at the before and after photo. But when you look at this photo, you can see there's no grass in the background of the spring, and there's more grass in this bucket than there is in the entire spring. And we can still use statistics and quantify, do rigorous science, but when we communicate it, there's nothing wrong with communicating emotion, because this is going to help people care for these places. And when you look at this, you should feel sad. And that doesn't take anything away from the science. It just makes you want to understand more and perhaps care for and protect this ecosystem. So emotions and feelings, like I said, kind of scare scientists, but it wasn't always this way. And we can learn a lot from many early scientists, such as Alexander von Humboldt and Ernst Haeckel, who used art to communicate science. This is, for example, a dye trace study in one of Florida's springs, which can bring a very, very complicated hydrological study to life. And no one ever is probably going to read this hydrological study, but when they look at this, they can see something that they might have questions about or could really understand if they started talking to a scientist, or, when I explain it to people at, exhibits or online or something like that. So again, it's engaging more people. So the two scientists that I just mentioned, Ernst Haeckel and Alexander von Humboldt, are in this amazing book by Andrea Wolf called The Invention of Nature. And I was midway through my PhD studying the ecology of Florida springs when I said, like I mentioned, I saw this disconnect between people and their fresh water. But I was being tugged between these two worlds of, journalism and communications and science. And so tends to be this really big disconnect as well between science and art. They're separated into their separate disciplines. And in this book, I started reading about these scientists that were like, this is not how it has to be, and this is not how it always should be. This is in the mid 1800s. So in the book, Andrea Wolf writes that Humboldt, who made this this drawing of plants and animals at different elevations in mountains. And so we can compare different species across elevations at different mountains across the world. And she writes that Humboldt's graphic visualization of scientific data was as innovative as it was simple. Instead of confusing tables, one look at his isotherm map revealed new world of patterns that hugged the earth in wavy belts. So that was a different one of his visualizations. But as you can see, he was taking science and communicating it to a wider audience outside of scientists. So Humboldt then wrote his book, Views of Nature, for a general audience rather than for scientists. And what I find especially interesting about this is that it was all happening in the early to mid 1800s. And the term scientist was actually coined first in 1834. And this was, I guess, the beginning of sort of the hardening of the lines between different scientific disciplines. And that very year that they talked about this word science and started breaking it up into different things and separating it from art and communications and even the own scientific disciplines from each other, Humboldt began writing a book that did exactly the opposite. So writing a book about science for the general public. And Wolf writes that as science moved away from nature and into laboratories and universities, separating itself into distinct disciplines, Humboldt created a work that brought together all that professional science was trying to keep apart. So after him, he really inspired German zoologist Ernst Haeckel, and who also, like I said earlier, was actually able to make science beautiful. Like a lot of the things that he drew were things that he looked at through his microscope. And he was actually the one who, if you recognize his name, he's famous for coining the term ecology in 1866. And in Humboldt's favorite book, or Humboldt's famous book, Cosmos, he had written about the bond that united knowledge, science, poetry, and artistic feeling. But Haeckel was kind of unsure how to apply that to his zoological work. And he said that Wolf writes in her book that he said he didn't know if he should use a paintbrush or a microscope. And it turns out that he actually ended up using both for his work. And Haeckel's illustrations show what Wolf called the narrative of nature. And she said that his compelling way of making evolution visible, and that art had become a tool through which Haeckel conveyed scientific knowledge. And for me, reading this was really powerful because a couple of years ago, National Geographic asked about the different hurdles that we had faced in our career. And I thought about it for a while, and I was like, well, I don't, have too many complaints except for kind of this pressure that I put on myself because of how we view science and communication. Art as very separate in our society, even though it shouldn't be that way. And I kind of had this feeling after I finished my PhD that I'd quit science to become a photojournalist who communicates science through imagery. And I now understand the value in my work as a conservation photographer and science communicator, because we have these societal pressures to kind of stay in academia or, follow a more traditional path. And when I shared this, I actually got an overwhelming response from other people that felt the exact same way. And it just shows how much we still kind of have to change in terms of how we view art, science, and these different disciplines. Because even in 1997, in her presidential address to AAAS, so obviously many years after these other scientists wrote about, combining art and science in the 1800s, Jane Lubchenco, who is like one of my biggest heroes, wrote that we needed a new, what she called a social contract for science. And basically we need to rethink how we interpret what science is and what it should do. And number 2 here that she writes is that scientists should communicate their knowledge and understanding widely in order to inform decisions of individuals and institutions. So we still, as you can see, struggle with this relationship between science and communications. And even though here, the president of AAAS is telling us that we need to, science and communication, communication is an essential part of science, basically. And this paper was written more than 20 years ago at this point, but it's still just as relevant today. I want to give you guys an example of kind of how we can bring this all together and tell a story about science that can be impactful. And this example goes back to Florida's freshwater springs. And these are river cooters, which are vegetarian turtles, and they live in the Santa Fe River Basin in the freshwater springs. And this river basin is actually a globally significant biodiversity hotspot for turtles. And it's home to 14 native species of freshwater turtles, which is almost the same number as the entire Amazon River system, which is 2,000 times the size of the Amazon River Basin. So when I went to tell this story, I was really trying to focus on how the grass was disappearing, like we saw before, but also how that was impacting, the ecology of the entire system, to use Haeckel's word, I guess. And the story, though, when I started thinking about it, it's not just about the grass and the turtles. So even if stories focus on communicating science, there's still stories about people, because the crucial part of storytelling is this connection, this human connection, and people want to connect with other people, right? So stories about science can help us go behind the scenes and watch these character-driven narratives that can help build trust in science and in scientists. So this is one of my favorite scientists, Dr. Jerry Johnson, and he is not only studying turtles and doing this incredible long-term research in the Santa Fe River Basin, but he's also making science more accessible to more people. So he's a professor at Santa Fe College in Gainesville, which is in the same town as University of Florida, which is this huge research university. And research isn't really part of his job description, even though he's this incredible teacher and he just loves turtles so much and wants to engage students in science. So he brings out his students and community members with the Santa Fe Turtle Project and actually has his students who have never conducted research before combined with local community members conduct the fieldwork with him, which is pretty incredible because for a lot of these students, it's their first time actually helping with research. But through this, he's engaged people who maybe didn't engage as much with science before, or didn't know what it was like to be out in the field with a researcher for the day, and now they know. Like, this woman is amazing. This is Trish Eaton, and she is a former canine handler for the Air Force, and she's now going back to school to study at Santa Fe and has been helping Jerry with his research for many years now, and has formed this really crucial part of the team. And it's just really neat to see people come together like this to actually work on science and make it more accessible. These are more of his students, and actually, I believe the couple on the outside, the guy in the pink shirt and the girl in the black shirt on the left, were people that he just found at the springs one day, and they thought it looked cool, and he was like, yeah, please come help us. So he's really, really engaging this community that wouldn't otherwise take part, and now doesn't have to see conducting research or science as this big kind of scary thing. So at the end of all of this, after they're done collecting data about the turtles, they do release them back into the river. And from the data that they've collected long-term, they're able to see where they last captured a turtle, whether it had eggs, how big it is, how much it's grown since the last time they found it, or maybe how far it's traveled to get there. Because they've actually, since the grasses have started disappearing, they've documented the longest movement of a freshwater turtle ever recorded, just so that it could find food. So once, we start communicating, or once we do science, of course, I'm saying that we should communicate it. So the same thing happens once you take photos, right? So you take photos and then you don't just leave them on your computer hard drive. You need to publish them and write up something, combine the photos with words in a way that can help more people understand it. This is just what Humboldt did with his drawings and his writing. We can do the same thing with photographs and writing as well. And so I ended up taking this long-term story and publishing it in the Huffington Post to talk about how the changing springs affects our drinking water, the grasses that grow there, and the freshwater turtles, but how this amazing scientist has used this as an opportunity to engage the community in research. And I want to transition one last time to talk very briefly about two very quick stories. So a lot of the work that I do focuses on women in science, because even though there are equal numbers of women and men that receive their doctorates in most scientific disciplines now, a lot of media stories don't tend to focus on women as much, and women aren't selected for upper level panels or faculty positions at the same rate as men are. So try to focus on them a lot in my storytelling about conservation and science. And again, this story is one that I just got back from working on last week. It was one that I started before the pandemic, published a small story on, and then went back to work with an all-female documentary crew working on a piece about her. This is Colleen Frankie, and she started a kelp farm for women in recovery. And she herself is in recovery, and this has been an incredible part of her process. And she has taught me so much. I love her dearly. She's now one of my good friends, and it's been really cool to be able to tell her story, but at the same time tell the story of the Gulf of Maine and how it's changing, which are my home waters. I grew up in New England, and so telling the story of kelp and changing ecosystem, but also through this really human personal angle that a lot of people can connect with. Another one that I worked on just before the pandemic started, my last trip out of the country, was one about sponge farming in Zanzibar. And sponge farming is a more sustainable alternative to seaweed farming that many of these women used to do, such as Najiri here, who is one of 11 sponge farmers on the island of Zanzibar off of Tanzania. And they're incredible because when they start to learn to farm sponges, they don't know how to swim. And they're on a traditionally Muslim island where most women wouldn't have jobs like this. So it was really inspiring to learn from them, but also cool to be able to tell this story about how as the water warms, it's not as profitable and feasible to grow seaweed anymore. And so we can start to grow sponges, but listing facts about sponges is not telling a story, and it's not going to engage people in the same way as they're going to if you tell a story about the people who farm the sponges and how sort of this environmental piece has impacted the lives of people who live there. So I want to end by just saying that we can measure impact in a lot of different ways. In grad school, I was learning how to, measure the impact of an environmental education program, or how to, I have a friend who's now studying how the impact of photos on people's environmental beliefs and decisions. And I think that one thing that you can't always measure directly, but is really, really important, is to inspire the next generation. And it's one of the best and lasting impacts that we can have. And this particular photo was sent to me by a mom who I had never met, and I was really far away on a remote Tahitian atoll when I got this Twitter message from this woman. And it was Halloween, and this is a picture of her daughter who dressed up like me for Halloween. And this was kind of like the biggest honor ever, to see a young girl seeing herself as an underwater photographer and seeing herself in this alternative career path that I never really would have seen myself in, and still kind of struggle with that identity as someone who was a scientist, but maybe still is a scientist, but just taking a different part of the scientific process that's still really important. And so for all of the young people out there listening, just remember that, like, this wasn't always a profession that I saw myself in, and that you have the ability to kind of change the boundaries of what it looks like to be a practicing scientist and to be as someone who communicates science. And we've known for a long time, as I mentioned, that scientists and scientific knowledge alone cannot create the resources and infrastructure needed to instigate societal change. So we need photographers, videographers, writers, painters, you name it, to really help bring science to life and communicate it to other people. Because if we do science and just leave it in the pages of science peer-reviewed journals, it's not gonna be enough. And we've known this since this article was written 10 years ago, or like 11 at this point somehow. We've known it since Jane Lubchenco gave her presidential address to AAAS in 1997 that we talked about earlier. And we've also known this since Alexander von Humboldt so powerfully combined science, art, and writing in the early 1800s. And so now I think it's time for us to get to work. So I'm happy to take questions. And if you want to reach out to me, here are ways that you can contact me. And I will leave it there.
All right. Thanks so much, Jenny. I really enjoyed that picture towards the end. That's the ultimate compliment there. That's so cool.
She really nailed it, didn't she?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something, doing education events on a regular basis for classrooms. I think it really kind of hits home that every scientist, explorer, adventurer, conservationist, they all remember someone who inspired them, or a book they read, or a documentary they saw, an inspiring educator. You just don't know where that moment's going to happen, that aha moment. And
exactly. Yeah, which is why I really appreciate what you've done, like with this festival, but also in your exploring by the seat of your pants work, because you never know, when you're talking to a classroom full of students. Like, I take that always just as seriously, if not more seriously, than, speaking to a giant group on a big stage somewhere, because you never know who you're going to inspire. And also their questions are always really awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the fun part too, is when someone just pauses and goes, I've never been asked that before.
Right. It's like, oh, okay.
Very cool. It seems like a relationship that should make total sense, because what's the point in doing science if only a few people are ever going to read a journal article? The general public are not interested in journal articles, and they're not written for the general public. So it just seems, what do you think has taken so long? Now I think we're starting to see science communicators are being taken out on more expeditions, photographers and such, to tell stories. But why did it take so long?
That's a great question. I wondered that a lot, when I was trying to feel more legitimate, during my PhD. I was like, well, there must be a way to do this. There must be a job that does this. There must be a program in grad school that does this. And there are some now. There are very few. Like, I ended up creating my own program in grad school to combine and take half of my classes in science and half in journalism. And then students will still email me now, like, how can I do that? And I'm like, I would love to help you, but my advisor was the director of the program, and this doesn't exist. And so unless you can convince someone that this is like worthy of a doctorate and that you can create a program like that, it is really hard. I think one of the big hurdles still is funding, and other people seeing it as a legitimate way. They're like, oh yeah, true, you can totally come take pictures on our scientific expedition. And you're like,
Yeah.
right. But here's my, $10,000 of gear and 10 years of experience. And you know what I mean? It's hard. And so there's a lot of, grant writing and stuff like that goes along with it. And I will also say that in journalism, it's really hard.
Sure.
I was actually just having this conversation earlier. I think it's not the journalist's fault. Like, a lot of funding has been cut for environmental journalism and, environmental and conservation writers specifically. So you end up having someone who covers politics covering an environmental story. And it's not their fault that they don't get all the nuances right, because I know I wouldn't if I was reporting a political story. It would be really difficult. But like, the lack of beat reporters in local newspapers, like, covering these issues has been really hard too.
Yeah. And it's too bad that positions and opportunities like that are being cut, because it couldn't be more important with the biodiversity crisis we're facing right now. We need it getting out to the public, in media, VR, AR, images, photo stories, video. I mean, that's what we need to get the message out, because science papers aren't going to cut it.
Right, exactly. I always say that, when people are competitive about story ideas or whatever, I'm like, there are way, way more stories than trained storytellers. Like, we almost need more people who have this training in and understanding of science, who are able to communicate these stories in powerful ways. Because if there are more of those, we could even work together. Like, I always love collaborating, because, whatever you do alone as like a single photographer on a story is never going to be as impactful as what you can do with a whole bunch of people who all kind of come together to work on an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. No question. Jenny, thank you so much. These sessions go by so quickly.
I know. I can't believe it's already 8:00.
Yeah. Stick around after if you can. We're heading to New Zealand to the National Kiwi Hatchery, so I'm pretty excited.
Oh, definitely. Yes. We will be watching that during dinner.
All right. Awesome. Well, Jenny, thank you so much. Always a pleasure. And I'm looking forward to the next stories and adventures from the sailboat.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thanks, Jenny.
Bye.